I don't care what that uniform says. I know what I see.
The clock above Gate B-22 at George Bush Intercontinental Airport read 4:47 in the morning, and the terminal was the kind of quiet that only exists in the hours before the world remembers itself. The fluorescent lights humming their indifferent tune overhead. The cleaning crew's cart squeaking somewhere down the concourse. The PA system murmuring flight information to nobody in particular. And in the middle of all that hollow institutional quiet, a man sat handcuffed to a steel bench. He was wearing a United States Navy uniform pressed correct immaculate in the way that only people who have been trained to treat their appearance as a professional obligation can manage after 31 days of overseas deployment and 4 hours of broken sleep on a military transport. The warfare pin above his left breast pocket caught the fluorescent light. The rank insignia on his collar told a story to anyone who knew how to read it. The silver star among his ribbons told a story that very few people in this terminal at 4:47 in the morning were equipped to understand. His wrists were in handcuffs threaded through the steel armrest of the bench. Standing over him, chest out, thumbs hooked into his belt, was Officer Raymond Cole of Houston Airport Security, a man who had just made the single most catastrophic miscalculation of his 16-year career, though he had not yet arrived at that understanding and would not for another 20 minutes. Cole was on his radio narrating his own competence to dispatch with the satisfied tone of a man who believed he had just solved a problem, and the small involuntary flicker in his eyes when he glanced down at the man on the bench said everything about what this moment actually was for him. It was not procedure, it was not diligence, it was not public safety. It was a performance, and he was enormously pleased with how it was going. What Officer Raymond Cole did not know, and what was about to rearrange every assumption he had ever made about his own authority, was that 40 yards down the concourse, the pressurized doors of Gate B-20 were about to open, and the men walking through them had spent the last month in places that did not appear on public maps, doing things that airport security contractors were not cleared to know about, and every single one of them had just spotted their brother sitting handcuffed to a bench in a Houston airport at 5 in the morning. What happens next would end Raymond Cole's career before the sun came up. 20 minutes earlier, Chief Petty Officer Marcus Dillon had been doing what he had been doing for most of the last 4 hours, sitting quietly waiting and thinking about his daughter. The gate area at B-22 was nearly deserted at that hour, the way airport terminals got in the deep valley between the last late-night departures and the first pre-dawn arrivals, when the only people left were the ones stranded by connections. The cleaning crews moving methodically through the echoing concourse, and the occasional traveler sitting alone in a plastic chair with the particular stillness of someone who has long since made peace with waiting. The air smelled faintly of industrial cleaner and stale coffee from the shuttered stand 2 gates down, and the overhead lights were doing their best impression of daylight without quite convincing anyone. Marcus Dillon, 38 years old. 13 years of active service, sat in one of those plastic chairs with his spine straight and his duffel bag olive green, military issue heavy with equipment, that was the legal property of the United States federal government, resting on the floor between his feet. He was not fidgeting. He was not scrolling a phone. He was simply present in the way that people who had been trained to be present in genuinely dangerous environments were present, which meant that he was aware of everything around him while appearing to be aware of nothing. He looked tired because he was tired, the deep, honest tiredness of a man who had given his body and his focus to his country for 31 consecutive days in a location he could not name in conversation, and who was now sitting in a Houston airport at 4:30 in the morning, waiting for the connecting flight that would put him back in the same city as his 9-year-old daughter in time for her school performance on Friday. That was the thing anchoring him right now, not the debrief he'd have to sit through, not the after-action reports waiting in his inbox, not even his own bed, which he had been thinking about with considerable longing for about the last 2 weeks. It was Maya specifically. The mental image of Maya in whatever costume her third-grade class had decided was appropriate for their spring performance, standing on a stage and looking for his face in the audience. He was going to be there. The silver star on his chest was not for show. Neither were the 3 deployment ribbons or the warfare pin above his breast pocket that indicated he had passed through training that fewer than 1% of people who attempted it ever completed. None of these things were things Marcus Dillon wore to be seen. He wore them because they were part of the uniform, and the uniform was part of who he was, and who he was had been forged in places and through experiences that a plastic chair in a Houston airport at 4:30 in the morning could not touch. To anyone walking past Gate B-22 in that quiet hour, he was simply a tired man in a military uniform waiting for a flight. That was exactly the problem. Officer Raymond Cole had been working airport security at Bush Intercontinental for 16 years, and in that time he had developed the particular posture of a man who had long since concluded that the space he moved through belonged to him in some fundamental and non-negotiable way. He was 44 years old, broad across the chest in a way that his uniform emphasized rather than flattered, with a face that tended toward red when his temperature rose, which it did more often than his supervisors would have preferred had they been paying closer attention. His personnel file, which the federal investigators would later spend considerable time with, contained 4 separate complaints of excessive force lodged over the preceding 5 years, and each of those 4 complaints had something in common beyond the complaints themselves. Every single one involved a black man, and every single one had been reviewed, noted, and quietly filed away by a management structure that had found it easier to manage the paperwork than to manage the officer. Cole was what happened when a pattern was allowed to become a career. His philosophy of the job, as best as anyone could reconstruct it from 16 years of behavior, was simple and deeply flawed in the way that simple things built on wrong foundations were always flawed. The uniform was authority. Authority was the right to demand compliance, and anyone who did not immediately comply was by definition a problem to be managed. He had never once in 16 years considered the possibility that the person standing in front of him might know more about their own rights than he knew about his own jurisdiction. That gap between what Raymond Cole believed his badge allowed him to do and what Title 10 of the United States Code actually permitted was the gap that would swallow his career whole before the morning shift change. At 4:44 in the morning, Cole was making his standard loop of the B-Con course, bored, mildly irritable in the way that night shifts made men irritable, looking for something to do in a terminal that was offering him nothing, when his eyes moved across the plastic chairs at Gate B-22 and stopped. A black man in a Navy uniform, alone, 4:30 in the morning, duffel bag at his feet. Cole's hand moved to his radio, then away, and then he started walking. He stopped 3 feet away and looked down at Marcus, the way men looked at things they had already decided about the question forming in his mouth, not out of genuine inquiry, but out of the procedural requirement to have said something before the conclusion he had already reached. "This your bag?" Marcus looked up at him, unhurried calm, with the particular quality of stillness that belonged to people who had been in rooms where the wrong movement could end everything and who had therefore learned to make every movement deliberate. "It is," he said simply. Cole's eyes moved over the duffel with the performance of scrutiny, rocking slightly on his heels, thumbs back in his belt, letting the silence stretch the way men stretched silence when they wanted the other person to feel the need to fill it with something that could be used against them. Marcus did not fill it. He had been trained not to fill it, and he understood exactly what was happening. "You military Navy," Marcus said. "Chief Petty Officer Marcus Dillon." Something moved behind Cole's eyes. Not recognition, not respect, but something closer to increased suspicion, wearing the costume of diligence. He looked at the uniform again, the rank, the warfare pin, the subdued sleeve patches, and the expression on his face shifted from authority into something uglier and more certain. He asked for identification, and Marcus reached slowly and deliberately into his breast pocket, the way a man reached for things when he knew every gesture was being catalogued by someone looking for a reason, and produced his common access card, the Department of Defense issued identification with embedded biometric data that required military infrastructure to replicate and had never in the history of the program been successfully counterfeited for airport use. Cole took it. He looked at it for longer than was necessary. He turned it over, tilted it under the fluorescent light, and when he looked back up at Marcus, the decision was already complete, and the critical, devastating, career-ending fact that the airport's 17 security cameras were quietly recording was this. The decision came after he looked at the card. Not before. After. He had looked at a Department of Defense biometric identification card, looked up at Marcus Dillon's face, and chosen not to believe what he was holding. "Where'd you get this?" Cole said, and his voice had gone flat and certain, the tone of a man building paperwork around a conclusion he had already written. "These can be faked. I've seen it before. Guys buy the uniforms online, get a decent fake ID printed, walk around collecting handshakes and free meals." He paused, letting the next words land with what he imagined was authority. "Stolen valor. It's a federal offense." Marcus said nothing for a moment, not because he had nothing to say, but because he had learned in far more dangerous rooms with far more dangerous men that the first word spoken after an accusation carried weight, and he chose his carefully. He told Cole that his orders were in the front pocket of the bag, along with his deployment papers, his travel voucher, and his military email on his phone that he could show all of it. Cole said he was going to need to search the bag. Marcus told him in the same level and almost quiet voice that the bag contained federal property, that Cole did not have jurisdiction over federal military equipment, and that his hold of authority in this terminal was concurrent with federal jurisdiction, not superior to it, and did not extend to detaining or searching active-duty military personnel traveling on official orders without probable cause that met federal standards. Something flickered across Cole's face. Not doubt, but the particular irritation of a man who had been answered correctly and did not like how it felt. He took a step closer, and his posture shifted in the way that men shifted when they felt their authority being navigated around instead of surrendered to. He said he had reasonable suspicion that the ID was fraudulent and the uniform wasn't Marcus's, and that he was going to need Marcus to stand up and come with him. "I'm not going to do that," Marcus said, not aggressively, not defiantly, just factually, the way a man stated a wind direction or a grid coordinate. Cole's face reddened. He went through the procedural motions one more time, his voice rising slightly, and Marcus responded with the same measured calm he had presented. Valid military identification had offered to show orders, and travel documentation had given Cole no probable cause, and Cole had no authority over federal military personnel, and he was not going to stand up. For a long moment, Cole just stared at him, and in that moment the last thin pretense of procedural legitimacy quietly stepped aside and made room for something rawer and less professional. His hand moved from his belt to his radio, then back again. He looked around the terminal once, a quick, almost involuntary survey, and then he unclipped the handcuffs. "Last chance," Cole said. Marcus looked at the handcuffs. Then he looked back up at the officer, and his expression was not fear, not anger, not desperation. It was something much older and more specific than any of those things, the particular exhausted sorrow of a man who had given 13 years of his life to his country and was now sitting in one of its airports, being shown without a single word, being said aloud, exactly what that country thought of him when the uniform was not enough. He stood up slowly. He put his hands out, and he said nothing because there was nothing left to say, and because somewhere in the disciplined part of his mind that never fully went offline, he already knew this was not over. Cole moved fast, the way men moved when they wanted the physical act to outpace any further argument. He grabbed Marcus's left wrist, spun him toward the bench with more force than the situation required, and snapped the first cuff on with the practiced efficiency of someone who liked the sound it made. The metal was cold. The click was loud in the quiet terminal. He threaded the chain through the steel armrest and locked the second cuff around Marcus's right wrist, leaving him seated, arms pulled slightly forward, tethered to the furniture. Marcus sat with his spine straight and his chin level, and he did not pull against the restraints, and he did not say a word. And the discipline required to do those two things in that moment was the kind of discipline that nobody outside the teams ever fully understood. Not the weapons training, not the sleep deprivation protocols, not the ability to operate for 72 hours in hostile terrain, but this, the ability to sit perfectly still inside a humiliating situation and not let a single cell of his body betray the storm underneath. He thought about Maya. Two travelers who had slowed to watch now stopped completely, and one of them had a phone out not for social media, but with the instinctive documenting impulse of people who recognized that something wrong was happening and wanted to be sure it existed on record. Cole was on his radio now, his voice carrying the inflated authority of a man narrating his own heroism to anyone who would listen. Dispatch. This is Cole at Gate B22. I've got a possible stolen valor situation. Subject detained requesting a secondary unit for property search and processing. He glanced down at Marcus as he said it, and there was something in that glance, a small, satisfied flicker that revealed more about Raymond Cole than anything else that had happened in the last 10 minutes. Marcus sat with his spine straight and let the words wash over him the way he had been trained to let a great many things wash over him. He was aware of every person in his peripheral vision, the gate agent, a young woman in a blue blazer who had appeared at the edge of the scene and was standing with wide, uncertain eyes, looking between Marcus and Cole as though she was trying to locate the version of events that made the most sense and not finding it. An older man in a business suit who had stopped walking and was standing about 20 feet back with his carry-on handle gripped tight and a jaw set in a way that suggested profound, barely contained fury. A woman in nursing scrubs who had stopped completely, her coffee forgotten at her side, her eyes moving between the handcuffs and Cole with the focused attention of someone who was cataloging details. Cole noticed the phones. His posture shifted almost imperceptibly. A slight squaring of the shoulders, a recalibration of his expression into something more official, and he turned fractionally away from the nearest camera housing in a movement so practiced it was probably unconscious. Marcus noticed that too, and filed it, and returned to stillness. He was thinking about Maya again, and about whether he would ever explain this to her, and about what he would say if he did. How he would find the words to tell a 9-year-old girl that her father's 13 years of service, his Silver Star, his 3 combat deployments, the warfare pin on his chest that he had bled to earn were not always sufficient to make a certain kind of person see him as what he was rather than what they had already decided he must be. He put that thought away. There would be time for it later, or there wouldn't, and either way, it wasn't useful right now. Somewhere down the concourse, past the still-growing cluster of onlookers and the gate agent who hadn't left, and the officer who thought he had already won a set of pressurized doors, exhaled open. And then came the footsteps, not one set, not two, but many. And Marcus recognized them before he saw the faces, not by the number of steps, but by their quality, by the particular unhurried collective weight of men who had spent enough time moving through the world together that their gait had become a single shared thing. He looked left down the concourse. And when he saw Frank Hargrove's face, something in his chest that had been locked down for the last 25 minutes released exactly 1 degree. Commander Frank Hargrove came through the gate doors the way he always came through doors first, and without ceremony, the biological imperative of a man who had spent 20 years leading people into places that were not designed for survival and had made it the most natural thing in the world to be the first one through. He was mid-sentence turned slightly toward Senior Chief Leon Parrish, compact iron-built from Savannah, with the deceptive stillness of a man perpetually doing structural calculations when his eyes swept the terminal in the automatic threat assessment habit that never switched off, not in airports, not on leave, not after 4 hours of broken sleep on a military transport after 31 days of deployment. He stopped walking, not dramatically, simply stopped the way a targeting system stops when it has acquired. Parrish stopped half a step later following Hargrove's sightline and went very still. Marcus Dillon. Gate B22. Wrists cuffed to the bench armrest. Duffel on the floor. Airport security officer standing over him with a radio in his hand and his chest out like he'd just made the arrest of his career. Neither man said anything for exactly 2 seconds. Then Parrish said very quietly and with a precision that contained an entire assessment of the situation in 7 words, "That man has absolutely no idea." Hargrove was already moving, not accelerating into urgency, because urgency was for people who needed to signal that something was happening. And Hargrove had never once in his career needed to signal anything but simply moving with the purposeful quality that parted crowds without demanding they part the physical communication of intent that required no translation. Parrish fell in beside him, and behind them, Staff Petty Officer James Okafor, a man from Detroit whose hands were the size of small shovels and whose stillness under pressure was legendary within the team. Petty Officer Derek Sandoval, the team's breacher, who had the quiet intensity of someone who had forced open more doors than he could accurately count. And Chief Petty Officer Craig Novak, the team's senior medic, who noticed everything and forgot nothing, and who registered the shift in Hargrove's stride and adjusted without a word being exchanged between them. Because that was the thing about men who had operated together long enough. The communication happened below the level of language in the shared grammar of gesture and weight and direction. Marcus heard them before he saw them, clearly recognized the cadence, and when he met Hargrove's eyes across the distance of the concourse, he kept his face still and passed everything that needed to be passed in that single look: the situation, the status, the instruction to stay measured. Hargrove received it, gave the smallest nod. Cole was still on his radio, his back half turned, still performing when the gate agent in the blue blazer took an involuntary step backward. The older man in the business suit, who had been standing rigid with barely contained outrage for the last several minutes, exhaled audibly, something loosening in his posture, as though he had been waiting for exactly this and hadn't known it until now. Cole registered the shift in the terminal's energy, the way all men like Cole eventually registered it too late and with the wrong instincts. He turned. He saw Hargrove first, then Parrish, then the 3 men behind them, and his radio hand lowered slightly. An involuntary response, the body processing what the mind was still trying to refuse. Hargrove stopped 6 feet from the bench. He looked at Marcus, at the handcuffs at the duffel, still sitting untouched on the floor, exactly where Marcus had left it, at the careful and controlled composure of a man who had been sitting in restraints for the better part of half an hour and had not once lost his bearing. And then he looked at Officer Raymond Cole with an expression that was not anger. Anger would have been easier to deal with, easier to dismiss, easier to file a report about, but cold, total, unsparing assessment. "Who are you?" Hargrove said, and it was not a question. "And what do you think you're doing to my man?" Cole opened his mouth. What came out had the shape of authority without any of the substance, like a frame with no canvas in it, something about a security matter. Something about needing Hargrove to step back, and Hargrove said with a precision that cut cleanly through the sentence, "That man is Chief Petty Officer Marcus Dillon. He is an active-duty United States Navy SEAL with 13 years of service, 3 combat deployments, and a Silver Star. He is traveling on official military orders, and he is my operator." The last 3 words were not loud. They were simply final in the way that certain statements were final not because they ended a conversation, but because they rearranged the entire architecture of the room. Cole tried again, reasonable suspicion, pending verification, and that was when the rest of them arrived. They came through the gate doors in a column that tightened naturally as they entered the concourse. 14 men in utility uniforms, some still rolling their shoulders loose from the transport, moving with the collective unhurried gravity of people who had spent the last month doing things that the ambient lighting of a Houston airport had no framework to hold. They were different sizes, different faces, different backgrounds, but they moved like a single organism that had just located the coordinates of a problem. And when they saw Hargrove stopped at the bench, when they saw Parrish's posture and Okafor's position and the handcuffs on Marcus Dillon's wrists, the column didn't accelerate or react with visible alarm. It simply oriented. Parrish moved to Marcus's left, positioning himself between the bench and the open concourse with the natural wordless efficiency of a man who had spent years putting his body between threats and the people he was responsible for. Okafor moved to the right. Sandoval and Novak closed the rear angle. And then the rest of the platoon filled the remaining space, and the gate area at B-22 was no longer a public terminal. It was a perimeter. Not aggressive, no raised voices, no hands near anything. Just presence, sheer, overwhelming, geometrically precise presence. 15 operators in a configuration that left Raymond Cole standing in the center of a circle he had not consented to enter and could not exit without walking through men who had been trained to hold ground in conditions that would have ended him. Cole turned once slowly and looked at the faces around him. Some watched him with open, measured contempt. Some watched with the blank professional neutrality of men who had learned to keep their expressions clean in operational environments. A few looked at Marcus with the particular quiet fury of brothers who had arrived too late to prevent something and were now doing the precise arithmetic of what came next. Not one of them said a word. The silence was enormous. The crowd of onlookers had grown considerably. The gate agent had been joined by a second airport employee, both of them standing well back with phones out now, not for social media, but documenting with the instinctive impulse of people who understood they were watching something significant. Robert Galloway, 67 years old, a retired federal judge who had been standing rigid in his business suit for the last 20 minutes, had not moved a single step. The woman in the nursing scrubs had been joined by a man in a pilot's uniform who had stopped mid-stride and was watching Hargrove with an expression of grim recognition. Craig Novak spoke for the first time, reading from a small laminated card in a low, carrying voice, not performing, just documenting aloud the way operators documented everything. Title 18, Section 242, Deprivation of Rights under Color of Law. Class E felony on first offense escalating with injury or established pattern of conduct. He looked up at Cole pleasantly. Just so we're all working from the same source material. Hargrove produced his own military identification and held it where Cole could see it clearly and did not hand it over. He gave his full name, his rank, his command, and then he outlined with the methodical precision of a man reading coordinates rather than making an argument exactly what Title 10 of the United States Code said about civilian law enforcement jurisdiction over active duty, military personnel, traveling on official orders, and what the footage currently running on 17 terminal cameras contained, and what the difference was between reasonable suspicion and what Cole had actually had, which was a black man in a uniform sitting quietly at a gate. I want you to be very precise with yourself right now. Hargrove said, his voice entirely even, about whether what you did was driven by reasonable suspicion or by something else entirely. The silence that followed had weight. Then Hargrove produced his phone and dialed without breaking eye contact with Cole, and the call connected in 2 rings, and when he spoke his voice was the same flat operational register he used to report grid coordinates. This is Commander Frank Hargrove, Special Warfare Command. I need federal marshals and military police at Gate B-22 Bush Intercontinental Terminal B. I have an active duty SEAL operator in unauthorized civilian detention on official travel orders. Yes. Now. Thank you. He ended the call and returned the phone to his pocket. The marshals will be here in approximately 8 minutes, he said. I'd strongly suggest you use that time to remove those handcuffs and think very carefully about whether you have anything you want to say that begins with an apology. Cole stood there for 3 more seconds. Then his hands, no longer entirely steady, reached for his keys. The handcuffs came off with the same metallic click they had gone on with, except this time the sound had a completely different meaning, and everyone in that gate area heard the difference. Novak was there before Cole had fully stepped back, crouching in front of Marcus with a pen light and steady hands examining both wrists with the focused efficiency of a man who had performed field assessments in conditions that made a fluorescent airport terminal look like an operating theater. He photographed each wrist from 3 angles, noted the time allowed for the record, and described the faint red pressure marks the metal had left in a voice so calm and precise it sounded like testimony, because it was. Marcus rolled his wrists once slowly and said nothing. He reached down and placed one hand on his duffel bag, not lifting it, just touching it, the quiet, deliberate re-establishment of a man reclaiming what was his. Cole had retreated 2 steps and was standing in the loose center of the perimeter with the particular stillness of a man who had run out of moves and was now simply waiting for whatever came next. The aggressive posture from earlier puffed chest proprietary stance, the physical language of a man who believed the ground belonged to him, had collapsed inward, leaving something smaller and considerably less certain in its place. Agent Sandra Merritt and her federal partner came through the concourse 8 minutes later, moving with the compact, non-performative efficiency of people who had responded to enough calls to have stopped performing urgency and simply embodied it. Behind them came 2 senior airport security directors, not floor-level staff, but the administrative tier, whose names were on the liability paperwork and whose phones had been ringing for the last several minutes with calls they had not enjoyed receiving. Merritt took in the scene in approximately 3 seconds. She looked at Hargrove. He looked at her. She brought her hand up in a crisp, clean salute. Her partner followed. After a beat that contained a small but significant hesitation, the hesitation of men recalibrating their understanding of exactly what they had walked into. Both airport security directors straightened and did the same. Hargrove returned the salute. Several of the senior operators came to attention without being asked, the automatic collective response of men for whom it lived in the muscle. Cole watched all of it, and his face had gone the color of old concrete. Merritt walked past him without acknowledgement and stopped in front of Marcus. "Chief Petty Officer Dillon," she said, "I'm Federal Marshal Sandra Merritt. Are you injured?" "No, ma'am. Do you require medical attention?" "No, ma'am." She nodded once, then turned and looked at Cole for the first time with the clean administrative clarity of someone identifying what needed to be processed and in what order. "Officer Cole. Badge and weapon, please." The senior airport security director, a heavy-set man named Garrett, 11 years in his position, who had never had a morning like this one, stepped forward before Cole could respond. His voice the tight, controlled sound of a man managing institutional damage in real time. "Officer Cole, you are hereby suspended pending federal review. Please comply immediately." Cole looked at Garrett, then at Merritt, then one final time at the circle of men around him, at their faces, their stillness, their complete and total absence of anything resembling doubt. And something in him arrived finally, and without any remaining resistance, at the full understanding of where he was and how he had gotten here. He unclipped his badge. He unclipped his weapon. He held them out with hands that were steady now, which was somehow worse than if they had been shaking, because steadiness at that point was the steadiness of a man who had moved past the place where trembling was available to him. The second marshal moved behind him with handcuffs. The same sound, the same cold metal, the same click. Marcus watched it happen from the bench, his duffel bag at his feet, his wrists free, and he did not smile, and he did not look away, because some things deserve to be witnessed. The gate area at B-22 returned to something resembling normal. Within the hour, the way airports always return to normal, with the efficient, slightly amnesiac resilience of places that had absorbed too many human dramas to be permanently altered by any single one. Marcus sat with Hargrove and Parrish in a side corridor while Novak completed his documentation, and Hargrove asked him one question. "You good?" Marcus said. "Yeah," and meant it. Mostly the qualification being not doubt about his own stability, but a kind of residue that he knew from experience would settle in the weeks ahead and become something smaller and more manageable, more like weather than wound. Robert Galloway, the retired federal judge in the business suit, approached Hargrove before the marshals finished their initial intake, introduced himself, quietly, shook hands, said he had been standing there from the beginning and had seen everything, and gave his contact information to Agent Merritt's partner without being asked. The woman in the nursing scrubs had already nailed her video over to the federal marshals directly 5 minutes before they arrived. the gate agent, the young woman in the blue blazer, gave a written statement at the scene. The pilot who had stopped mid-stride in the concourse did the same. Marcus boarded his flight on schedule. He did not look back at gate B-22. He put his bag in the overhead compartment, settled into his seat, closed his eyes, and thought about Friday and about Maya standing on a stage looking for his face, and he was asleep before the boarding door closed. The federal investigation that followed moved with the grinding, comprehensive thoroughness of a machine that had been handed exceptional raw material and was determined not to waste it. All 17 security camera feeds from Terminal B were preserved within the first hour, time-stamped unedited, cataloged by the Federal Marshal's Office, and subsequently analyzed frame by frame with a patience that Raymond Cole had never imagined anyone would apply to his actions. What the footage showed across 17 angles and 43 uninterrupted minutes was a story with no ambiguity in it. It showed Cole approaching Marcus Dillon's gate position before any interaction had occurred, and before any behavior that could conceivably have triggered a legitimate security response. It showed the ID exchange, and it showed with the unforgiving precision of cameras that had no opinion and no loyalty, the exact moment Cole looked at a Department of Defense biometric identification card, looked up at Marcus Dillon's face, and made his decision. Not before the card. After it. The footage made the defense's later argument about reasonable suspicion very difficult to sustain and ultimately impossible to make convincingly to 12 people who had all watched the same 30 seconds of video. Cole's personnel file was subpoenaed and reviewed in its entirety. The 4 excessive force complaints, each one involving a black man, each one quietly processed into irrelevance by a management structure that had valued institutional ease over institutional accountability, were laid out in sequence, and what had been managed as 4 separate incidents became in the context of a federal investigation. Something the prosecutors could describe to a jury as a pattern of conduct, a documented record of behavior that no reasonable employer could claim ignorance of, and no reasonable person could interpret as coincidence. The airport's contracting company was notified that its security protocols, training standards, and complaint review procedures would be subject to federal audit. The 2 senior directors who had saluted in the gate area at B-22 spent a significant portion of the following weeks in meetings with lawyers. Craig Novak's photographic documentation of Marcus's wrists. 12 photographs, 3 angles each. Clinical notation, precise timestamps was entered into evidence as Exhibit 12 and would prove more durable and more persuasive than anything the defense offered in response. The case was designated United States v. Cole, assigned to federal court in the Southern District of Texas, and moved from incident to trial in 9 weeks, which said something about the quality and completeness of what the prosecution was working with. The morning after the incident, Raymond Cole was placed on suspension pending federal review, and the airport security contractor that had employed him for 16 years terminated his contract before noon. He was not handcuffed. He was not taken to jail. Not yet. The formal charges came later. The arrest quieter than he had imagined in the parking lot of his own house on a Tuesday morning with 2 federal agents who were entirely professional and entirely without warmth. The lawyer Cole retained reviewed the evidence file, called him into the office, sat across the desk from him, and told him without ceremony that what the prosecution was holding was not a difficult case for them, and that his options were limited in ways that reflected the quality of what 17 cameras had captured. Cole sat with that information for a week before he could make himself believe it was real. Diane did not leave. This surprised him and continued to surprise him in the weeks that followed, and he eventually understood that his surprise at her staying revealed something about how little credit he had given her during the years when he had been too busy being certain of himself to see her clearly. She sat across from him at the kitchen table one evening without raising her voice and told him that she was staying, but that everything was going to be different, and that different meant he was going to spend whatever time he had left figuring out who he actually was when there was no badge doing the talking for him. He nodded. He did not argue. He was learning that she was right. Their son Tyler was 19. tall, earnest quiet in the specific way of young men who had grown up watching their fathers carefully and had made a private, unarticulated decision somewhere along the way to try to become something better. Tyler had wanted to join the Navy since he was 15, had applied, had passed his physical, had scored well on his ASVAB, and then the background check had reached his father's federal record, and the waiver process had begun and stalled, and produced a letter in the careful bureaucratic language of institutional rejection that said his application could not be approved at this time. Tyler had gone to his room and closed the door without a word, and Cole had stood in the hallway outside it, understanding with a weight that was unlike any weight he had previously carried that his failures had reached forward in time and taken something from his child. He did not know what to do with that. He still didn't. Marcus Dillon landed at his home airport on a Thursday afternoon, walked through the terminal with his duffel over his shoulder, and pushed through the arrivals door to find Maya standing on her toes at the barrier, scanning faces with the furious concentration of a 9-year-old who has been waiting 45 minutes and is not about to miss the moment. She spotted him and came through the small gap in the crowd at a dead run, and he dropped to one knee on the arrivals floor and caught her and held her and did not let go for a long time. He did not tell her what had happened at Gate B-22. Not that morning, not that week. He sat with it himself the way he sat with things that needed processing, turning it over in the quiet parts of his mind while Maya showed him her costume for the performance, and his mother fed him the first real meal he'd had in over a month. He thought about Cole, genuinely thought about him not with anger, which had never been the dominant note for Marcus, but with something more complicated and more honest, the way a man thought about a thing he needed to understand before he could decide what to do with it. He went back to work the following Monday. He did not speak to the press. He did not post anything on any platform. He returned every call from journalists with a polite and definitive no comment because that was not the arena he operated in and never had been. But something had settled in him during the weeks since the airport quiet, and certain the way the most important decisions always settled, and one evening while Maya was doing homework at the kitchen table and the apartment smelled like the dinner he'd made and the spring air coming through the open window, Marcus sat down and began to write a letter. The courtroom assigned to United States versus Cole was a federal one, which meant it had the particular gravity of a room where the government was not performing justice but administering it. No gallery packed with spectators hungry for spectacle, no television cameras, no theatrical flourishes of any kind. Just the clean institutional weight of proceedings that moved with the unhurried certainty of a machine that had already made its assessment of the evidence and was now simply working through the formal requirement of presenting it. Cole sat at the defense table in a suit that was slightly too large, borrowed or bought in a hurry for a body that had lost weight in the months since the arrest, and he was not recognizable as the man who had stood in the gate area at B-22 with his chest out and his thumbs in his belt. Something had been removed from him in the intervening weeks, some structural certainty that had been so fundamental to how he carried himself that without it his posture no longer knew what to do. He looked smaller, which he was, in the ways that mattered. The prosecution began by putting the footage on the screen, all 17 angles, no narration, no editorial commentary. Just the footage itself, played in chronological sequence with the timestamps running in the corner of each frame and the quiet hum of the courtroom's ventilation system as the only sound in the room. The jury watched in the particular collective stillness of 12 people absorbing something they could not turn away from, and the footage required very little assistance from anyone in the room to make its argument. It showed Cole moving toward Gate B-22 before any interaction had occurred, before Marcus had done anything, said anything, or moved in any direction that could have generated a legitimate security concern. It showed the approach with the particular deliberateness of a man who had already decided. And it showed the ID exchange, and then it showed the moment that federal prosecutor Rachel Torres would later describe to the jury as the center of the entire case. Cole holding a Department of Defense Common Access card, biometrically embedded, government-issued, federally backed, looking at it, and then looking up at Marcus Dillon's face. And in the fraction of a second between those two things, making the decision that ended his career. Not before the card. After it. Torres presented Cole's personnel file in its entirety, the 4 complaints, their dates, their subjects, their identical demographic profile, and the management responses that had processed each one into irrelevance. She did not use the word conspiracy. She did not need to. She simply laid the 4 complaints end to end and let the jury look at them in sequence, and the pattern they formed was unmistakable to 12 ordinary people in a way that it had apparently been perfectly ignorable to the men who signed the review forms year after year. Craig Novak's photographs were entered as Exhibit 12, 12 images, 3 angles each. Clinical notation, precise timestamps, and Novak walked the jury through each one with the focused specificity of a man who had been trained to observe things. Other people missed the pressure, marked distribution, consistent with restraints applied with force beyond what the situation required, the faint contusion patterning at the inner wrist, the timestamps placing the photographs within 4 minutes of the restraints being removed. The defense argued reasonable suspicion throughout, and the footage made that argument increasingly difficult to make with a straight face, and by the 3rd day of testimony, the defense attorney had begun to look like a man who was doing his professional duty while privately aware that he was doing it in a building with no exits. Commander Frank Hargrove testified on the 4th day, arriving in his dress uniform with his medals in their correct and precise rows, and he took the witness stand with the same posture he brought to operational debriefs and intelligence reviews, completely without performance, completely without effect, and therefore completely devastating to anything that attempted to stand against it. He answered every question with dates, times, regulatory citations, and a chronological account of events so detailed and internally consistent that the defense attorney's cross-examination lasted less than 11 minutes before quietly running out of productive ground. Hargrove cited Title 10. He cited the specific federal standards for probable cause in the context of active duty, military personnel on official travel orders. He described in precise and unembellished language what he had seen when he came through the gate doors at B-22, and what he had done in response, and why, and the jury listened to it the way juries listen to testimony that did not require them to decide whether to believe it. Leon Parrish followed him. Then James Okafor. Then Novak, again submitting his medical documentation for the record. Then Robert Galloway, 67 years old, 31 years on the federal bench before retirement, who testified that he had been present at Gate B-22 from the beginning of the encounter and had observed no behavior by Marcus Dillon that would have justified any security response under any standard he was aware of, and that he was aware of quite a few. Marcus Dillon testified last. He wore his dress uniform, and he sat in the witness chair with his hands folded on the railing, and he answered every question in the same quiet, level voice he had used at Gate B-22, the voice that had nothing to prove and nothing to hide, and was therefore the most credible sound in the room. He described the approach, Cole stopping 3 feet away, looking at the bag, the performative silence, the question about ownership. He described producing his common access card, the extended examination of it under the fluorescent light, and the moment Cole looked up from the card and asked where he'd gotten it. He described offering to produce his orders and travel documentation, and Cole's refusal and the escalation to the handcuffs, and the moment he stood up and put his hands out, and he described all of it without embellishment, without visible anger, without the kind of emotional weight that a defense attorney could characterize as bias or instability, because he was describing it the way he described everything. He had been trained to describe factually, sequentially, with the authority of a man who had been there and remembered every detail. Chief Petty Officer Dylan Torres said from the podium, when Officer Cole produced the handcuffs, "You chose to comply rather than continue to assert your legal rights verbally. Can you explain that decision to the jury?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, a genuine pause, not a performed one, the pause of a man locating the exact right words for something he had thought about carefully. Because I knew he said that how I behaved in that moment was going to matter more than what was being done to me. And because I've operated in environments where losing your composure gets people killed. This wasn't one of those environments, but the discipline doesn't turn off. And I also knew he said, and his eyes moved briefly without drama to the camera housings mounted above the gate desk in the footage the jury had now watched multiple times, that everything was being recorded, every second of it. The courtroom was quiet. The defense attorney David Kessler rose for cross-examination with the expression of a man who had mentally reviewed his options and concluded that none of them were good, but that professional obligation required him to attempt at least one. Chief Petty Officer Dillon, isn't it true that by refusing to comply with Officer Cole's initial request to stand and accompany him, you escalated the situation and effectively provoked? Marcus leaned slightly forward into the microphone, and his voice remained exactly the same temperature it had been for the last 40 minutes. What initial lawful request are you referring to, Counselor? He had no probable cause. He had no federal authority over my person or my equipment. He had no basis under Title 10 to detain me, search my property, or compel my cooperation. What he had Marcus said, and every person in that courtroom heard the next sentence with the same absolute clarity, was a black man in a military uniform sitting quietly at a gate. That is what he had, and I would respectfully suggest that you consider very carefully whether that constitutes a lawful request. Kessler looked at his notes. He looked at the jury. He looked at Torres, who was looking at her hands with the focused neutrality of a woman who had learned not to react visibly to moments like this one. He sat down. No further questions, Your Honor. The jury was out for 3 hours and 47 minutes, which was not a short deliberation, but was, given the complexity of a federal civil rights case, a remarkably decisive one, and said something clear about what 12 ordinary people had concluded after watching 17 angles of footage and listening to 6 days of testimony. They came back at 4:18 in the afternoon. Cole stood when the verdict was read, his attorney's hand briefly on his arm, his eyes fixed on the middle distance with the expression of a man receiving something he had on some fundamental level always known was accumulating in his direction. Not this specific moment, not these specific words, but the general shape of a reckoning that the choices of a career had been building toward for a long time. Guilty deprivation of rights under color of law. Guilty civil rights violation. Guilty conduct unbecoming a law enforcement officer. All counts. The verdict delivered with the clean, unambiguous finality of a decision that had not required significant debate. The sentence came at the hearing 2 weeks later. 24 months of federal probation, permanent and irrevocable revocation of his law enforcement certification in the state of Texas, mandatory civil rights training and evaluation, and a federal civil judgment attached to his name that would surface on every background check for the remainder of his working life. He would never carry a badge again. The airport contracting company settled with the federal government for an amount that covered the audit, the policy overhaul, and the mandatory retraining of every security officer in the Houston terminals. Raymond Cole walked out of the federal courthouse on a gray November afternoon and drove home in a car that no longer had a radio program he wanted to listen to, in a city that no longer felt like a place where he was certain of his own standing, and he sat in the driveway for a long time before he went inside. The warehouse distribution center on the western edge of Houston opened at 5:30 in the morning, and Raymond Cole was always there before it did. He worked the early shift scanning packages and moving pallets on a floor crew of 12, most of them 20 years younger than him, none of them interested in who he used to be or what the badge on his old uniform had once meant to him. The work was physical and repetitive and demanded nothing from him except his body and his attention, and he had found, to his genuine surprise, a kind of stripped-down dignity in the simple completion of tasks that had clear beginnings and clear endings and no moral complexity embedded in them whatsoever. You picked it up, you moved it, you put it down. The barcode either scanned or it didn't. The pallet either fit or it didn't. Nobody's life depended on your interpretation of ambiguous circumstances. He was good at it, which was not something he had expected to discover about himself, and he held that knowledge quietly, the way a man held things that surprised him about his own character late in life. Diane was still there. 11 months after the verdict, she was still there, and he was still learning slowly, imperfectly, with the grinding difficulty of a man dismantling a structure he had spent 16 years building, that she had been right. About most of it. About what the badge had been doing for him that he had been unable to do for himself, about the space it had been filling that he would have to learn to fill some other way, about who he might be when the performance was over, and there was nothing left but the plain fact of the person. Tyler was the part that still woke Cole at 3 in the morning. Sometimes the image of his son's face reading that rejection letter, the door closing quietly, the hallway, and the weight of understanding what his choices had cost a person who had never made them. Tyler was 19. He had wanted the Navy since he was 15. He had done everything right, and the record attached to his father's name had followed him into an office at a federal recruitment center and quietly closed a door that Tyler had earned the right to walk through. Cole had not figured out what to do with that, and the honest truth was that he was not sure there was anything to do with it, that it was simply the shape of a consequence, and consequences had the particular ungentle quality of being exactly as large as the actions that produced them, and not 1 inch smaller. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, standard white, unremarkable, a Virginia Beach return address that Cole stared at for a long moment without placing, before his eyes caught the zip code and something shifted in his chest in the direction of recognition without quite arriving there. Tyler opened it at the kitchen table while Cole was pouring his morning coffee, standing at the counter with his back half turned, listening to the sound of paper unfolding. He heard the silence that followed, not the silence of nothing happening, but the particular silence of a person reading something twice because the first time through it hadn't fully resolved into sense. "Dad," Tyler said, and his voice had a quality Cole hadn't heard in it for a long time, careful held the voice of someone trying very hard not to reveal how undone they were. "You need to read this." Cole put his coffee down and took the letter and stood there in the kitchen in the early morning light with the refrigerator humming its indifferent hum behind him, and read it through once and then again from the beginning. It was a formal character endorsement, precisely worded, structurally correct, written in the kind of careful and authoritative language that carried genuine institutional weight, the kind of letter that moved through bureaucratic channels, not by demanding attention, but by making itself impossible to ignore. It addressed Tyler's application, directly spoke to his character and potential and fitness for service in specific and substantive terms, made the case methodically and without a single wasted word for why the sins of a father should not constitute the ceiling of a son. It cited Tyler's academic record. It cited his AS/VAB scores. It made in 12 paragraphs the kind of case that the people who processed waiver requests were going to have a difficult time setting aside. It was signed by Chief Petty Officer Marcus Dillon, United States Navy. Cole read the name twice. He set the letter down on the table very carefully, the way you set down something fragile, and he stood in his kitchen in the early morning with his coffee going cold at his elbow and something happening in his chest that he did not have a clean word for. It was not quite relief, not quite gratitude, not quite shame, though it held elements of all three and something else underneath them that was older and more fundamental than any of them. The feeling of being seen completely, including the worst of himself, especially the worst of himself, and having grace extended anyway, not because he had earned it or deserved it, but precisely and specifically because he had not. Marcus Dillon had every reason in the world to let Raymond Cole's choices follow Raymond Cole's son through every door for the rest of his life. He had chosen instead to walk to that door himself and hold it open. Diane appeared in the kitchen doorway, read the room in the way she had always been able to read rooms when he had been too busy occupying them to notice her doing it, and said nothing. She crossed to him and put her hand on his arm, and Cole let her, which was itself still a thing he was learning how to do. Tyler was on the phone now, voice low and careful, trying very hard not to sound as undone as he was, and not entirely succeeding. Cole picked up the letter one more time and read Marcus Dillon's name. And Raymond Cole, who had not cried since the day the verdict was read, sat down at his kitchen table and let it happen, not for himself, not for what he had lost, but for the standard he had failed to meet, and for the man who had chosen freely and without any obligation whatsoever to meet it for him anyway. Marcus Dillon never spoke publicly about what happened at Gate B-22. No interviews, no posts, no statements of any kind. He sent the letter, went back to work, and showed up to Maya's school performance on a Friday evening and sat in the front row and clapped louder than anyone in the auditorium when she walked out on that stage. That is the thing worth understanding about people like Marcus Dillon. The most significant things they do are almost never the things anyone sees. The mission at the airport was not the one with guns and hostile terrain. It was the one on the bench in the handcuffs in the decision to stay composed and let the truth do its own work. And the letter to Tyler Cole was not a grand gesture. It was just a man who had been given every reason to destroy something, choosing instead to build it. Tyler Cole received his Navy enlistment approval 6 weeks after the letter arrived. He reported for basic training the following spring, and he carried his father's failures with him not as a burden, but as a map, a detailed and honest accounting of the exact roads not to take. Real power, the kind that lasts, and the kind that actually means something, has never lived in a badge or a title or a uniform or the number of people who move out of your way when you walk down a hallway. It lives in what you do with the moments when you could destroy something and choose not to. Marcus Dillon had every reason. He made a different choice. That choice is the whole story. If this story reached something in you, share it not for the algorithm, not for the numbers, but because somewhere out there is someone who needs to be reminded that the strongest thing a person can do is choose grace when everything around them is pointing toward retaliation. Subscribe to our channel for more stories about real strength, quiet honor, and the kind of justice that doesn't need an audience. And if you've ever served, been judged before, anyone knew your name, or watched someone choose dignity over revenge, drop it in the comments, because this story belongs to all of you. The strongest people in any room were never the loudest ones. They were the ones who could have burned it all down and didn't.